Great Demon King, Chapter 56. The Pain That Accompanies the Happy Fate of a Man. Because of Felix's words, the once smoothly cooperating warriors and mages who had been defending against the orc wolf riders abruptly sank into panic. In an instant, the disciplined unity that had held their formation together dissolved, and people became so distracted by the terror of the situation that they frantically contemplated their means of escape rather than continuing the defense. In the span of a moment, the impregnable defense collapsed. Apart from the warriors at the very front who continued fighting as they retreated, the mages and archers lost their composure entirely, panicking and scattering in all directions as if caught in a sudden violent storms. The organized resistance disintegrated into chaos. Amidst the tumult, Shuo grabbed Fanny's and Lisa's wrists and forcefully hauled the two with great haste toward the area where the battle steeds were stabled. Behind him, Jean barked out orders, directing the other necromancy major students to follow closely, their movements synchronized by the urgency of the situation. After several rounds of life-and-death skirmishes that had tested every fiber of their resolve, Shuo was no longer naive nor terror-stricken when faced with danger. Quietly, he assessed his next course of action as he calmly sped forward, his mind focused on the need to secure their escape amidst the chaos. Also retreating with Shuo and the others were a few additional mages and archers, moving like the tide, steady and unyielding. If any of these individuals had attempted to block Shuo's forward progress, they would have been shoved aside without a moment's hesitation by the overwhelming flow of panicked bodies. In the chaos of the crowd, the archers and mages struggled to increase their speed, their efforts hampered by the disorganized throng. Yet, with Shuo acting as a steadfast meat shield, they managed to push forward and eventually make it to the front after a brief but intense period of adjustment. After roughly 15 minutes, Shuo had finally hauled Fanny and Lisa to the area where the battle steeds were stabled, with Jean and the other necromancy students following far behind in a desperate, organized retreat. The master of the stables had gone out to the southern streets to observe the earlier events, leaving behind only a servant to watch over the horses. Without hesitation, Shuo broke down the door and pulled Fanny and Lisa toward the stables in the back. "What are you doing? Just what are you doing?" The elderly servant bellowed in panic as he saw Shuo forcefully breaking down the door and rushing toward the stables. His voice trembled with both anger and fear. "The orc wolf riders have already fought their way here. If you continue to stay, you'll face only death. We're here to pick up the battle steeds that we stabled here. If you want to live, then hurry. Choose a battle steed and flee," Shuo explained calmly yet urgently as he dashed toward the stables, his words cutting through the din of chaos. The elderly servant, having already heard the commotion outside, paused in shock for a moment before hastily following Shuo's lead toward the stables. It was as if he had no choice but to accept the grim reality of their situation. Once at the stables, Shuo released Fanny's and Lisa's hands, and his eyes made a desperate sweep of the surrounding sons. His gaze soon landed on a handsome, imposing battle steed, and without a word, he vaulted onto its back in a single fluid motion. In one swift motion, he swung the dagger in his hand and slashed through the ropes that restrained the battle steed, freeing it for immediate use. Turning his head, Shuo saw that Jean and several of the light major students had also reached the stables. All were panting, their faces etched with urgency as they joined Fanny and Lisa in searching for the horses they had stabled earlier. "Are you all idiots? The orc wolf riders will be here any second. What are you looking around for? Not to mention the battle steeds we stabled last time were all inferior beasts. There were only 6 of them. Do you want to die?" Shuo's impatient roar echoed through the stables. His voice was harsh and filled with derision as he called them idiots, a word that shocked the necromancy students and teachers, who froze momentarily, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and reluctant understanding. "Then what do we do?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling as she looked up at Shuo. "Choose the best, strongest battle steeds. We'll each take one. The lives of others have nothing to do with us. If you all want to die, then continue looking for the inferior battle steeds we had," Shuo declared resolutely, his face darkening with determination. His words struck them like a wake-up call. For these necromancy students and teachers, who had long been bound by a multitude of rules and customs, following the rules was second nature. They had never considered that in times of crisis, all rules could be broken. The shock on their faces soon turned to contemplative frowns as they absorbed the ruthless practicality in Shuo's words. The commotion outside grew louder as panic continued to ripple through the group, and decisions were made with swift finality in the face of impending death. No longer hesitating, they surged toward the fiercest and most valiant battlesteeds with faces set in grim resolution. Once the necromancy students and teachers had all occupied the best battlesteeds in the stables under Han Shuo's unyielding urging, they rushed out of the stables. It was then that the light major students from the academy and other clear-headed mages and archers finally emerged to join them, their movements hurried and precise as they recognized the gravity of the situation. Damn it, they're riding our battlesteeds. Irene's sharp eyes immediately spotted that the handsome battlesteed Han Shuo now rode was the very same one she had ridden just days before. She immediately voiced a loud complaint, her tone a mixture of indignation and disbelief. However, at that moment, Han Shuo and his group were already riding the fiercest battlesteeds in the stables, having rushed out with due haste. They ignored the curses from Irene and the others, leaving only receding silhouettes as they disappeared into the night. "Brian, where should we go now?" Fanny immediately asked Han Shuo as soon as they left the stables and reached the chaotic streets. Her voice, although steady, conveyed the urgency of the situation. The warriors had already retreated into the town of Droll, and the orc wolf riders had rushed into town, whirling their longswords mightily. The defenseless merchants were the first to suffer, their heads falling as the swords chopped down indiscriminately. The wolf riders, mounted on giant wolves, were in no hurry to pursue the escaping warriors and mages immediately. Instead, they followed the main street and began looting the first stores they encountered, stuffing the resources of the surrounding shops into large bags hanging from the bodies of the giant wolves. "As long as it's not in the direction of Sajoski City, it doesn't matter where we flee to." Han Shuo surveyed the surroundings and cast a discerning glance toward the eastern street. Noticing that fewer people were fleeing along the northern street, he called out after a moment's thought, "Follow me, we'll head north." Because the town of Droll was on the brink of collapse, and with Sajoski City, the most heavily fortified city in the southern part of the empire, becoming the ideal refuge, Han Shuo observed that 70% of the people in Droll were fleeing in that direction. However, among this 70%, only about 10 were on battlesteeds. Once the orc wolf riders finished raiding the town, they would undoubtedly target this group first, for those riding giant wolves possessed the speed advantage and were easier to overrun. As soon as his thoughts crystallized, Han Shuo immediately led the battlesteeds with Fanny and the others, racing to the northern street. With the convenience of the battlesteeds, Han Shuo and his crew moved exceedingly fast. Along the way, he encountered 2 swift wolf riders on the northern street. The bags on their giant wolves bulged heavily, and they seemed intent on rushing into another store to loot. Snorting coldly, Han Shuo lifted the reins and directed his battlesteed to change its course, charging straight toward the 2 wolf riders who were raising their longswords without reserve. The 2 wolf riders started in shock. It was as if they had never anticipated someone daring enough to take the offensive. They quickly withdrew their longswords and abruptly split up, waving their weapons in a frantic attempt to fend off the rapidly advancing Han Shuo. "Brian, are you crazy? Run!" Lisa, from a distance, screamed in panic as she saw Han Shuo's battlesteed change direction and charge toward the wolf riders. Her cry drew the attention of the necromancy students and teachers, who turned their heads involuntarily, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and alarm. Wielding a dagger as his horse charged, Han Shuo quietly chanted a magical spell. In response, a bone arrow abruptly materialized in midair, whistling as it flew toward one of the wolf riders. As that wolf rider raised his long sword in defense, the dagger in Han Shuo's hand surged forth toward the other wolf rider. The dagger traced a cold, sharp arc through the air and sank into bone with a soft, decisive sound. It passed through the longsword's defenses, piercing a bloody hole in the wolf rider's chest. At that precise moment, Han Shuo's battlesteed arrived with swift urgency. He clawed at the reins, and the horse abruptly halted amid violent whinnies. Seizing the moment, Han Shuo's left arm reached out and yanked forcefully, dislodging the longsword from an orc who was already dead. With his right hand, he then wielded the recovered longsword, slashing down to create a bloody opening in the head of an agitated giant wolf. The giant wolf, overwhelmed by the brutal strike, collapsed in a ragdoll heap onto the ground. With a flick of his sword, the large bag hanging on the giant wolf suddenly shot out and landed directly on the battlesteed behind him. Shortly thereafter, Han Shuo's battlesteed changed direction again, and he charged with a face of cold cruelty toward the other wolf rider, who had just managed to pulverize the bone arrow. "Oh my word, did I see incorrectly? Brian just cast the bone arrow magic. What the hell is going on?" Jean pulled tightly on his battlesteed's reins, his voice filled with shock, while the other students stared at Han Shuo in disbelief, as if witnessing him for the first time. "Damn it, What is Brian doing? Fanny, knowing well that Han Shuo could cast bone arrow magic, was startled by his current actions, robbing the Wolf Riders after they had looted the stores, a move that defied expectations in the midst of chaos.